they've always been humans, my guy. They've always been there.
I understand that. That's the whole. But what I'm saying is that for you as a perspective, right? That is all development of the characters that are the side characters. That is related to development of Lorraine and of George. That's not related to Marty's development as a
Oh my
character.
gosh. Yes, it is. Look. Let me explain this. Okay.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of A Lost Plot. I am your host, as always, Maverick, and today we have back with us again two of our favorites to help us review a classic film. That's right, we've got Andrew and Avalon back with us to review Back to the Future, a 1985 American science fiction film which was written by Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale and directed by Robert Zemeckis. So, as always, we like to give those initial impressions. Andrew, what is your initial thoughts on the film of Back to the Future? What is your biggest takeaway?
Time travel and weird incest.
That's a hot
You wonder
take.
why I don't start with you.
I have many thoughts, but you said initial, and the first thing that comes to mind whenever I think about Back to the Future is time travel and going on a date with your mom, which is cursed and so foul.
Avalon, go ahead.
Well, this is one of those movies I remember watching as a kid and it had a deep impact on me. I come back to it years later and it kind of still holds up in my mind, where it's like, yep, it's still kind of got all the appeal to it that it had back then for me. So,
Yeah, the thing that really struck me when I rewatched this is, this is a classic, right? It's a time travel film. It's all about, I guess, people back in the day, going back to a time even older than that. And there's some, it's tight is maybe where I'd go with it. That, like, the story's pretty, there's not a bunch of nonsense going around. Pretty much everything that you see matters to some degree, and that it all flows together pretty cohesively. This is something that I've seen a lot, especially with older kids' movies, where you have that with, The Lion King and a lot of other classic children's movies where everything is pretty tight, but at the same time, it's a good story and it all flows together pretty well. This is the same kind of thing, but more in the adult genre rather than a kids genre or kids format of a film. You see the same kind of thing. So, older films are really good at doing this, where they made sure that the film was well established and quickly goes right into the story, shows you why we should care, and goes into the plot. So they did well with that, and they continue with that throughout the story going forward. So, overall, it's a solid story, and it's worth revisiting, which is why we're doing that today. But before we get into the meat of the story, Avalon, can you tell the viewers who are unfamiliar with Back to the Future what Back to the Future is about?
So Back to the Future is about a kid named Marty McFly, a high school student, who is helping a local, scientist, Doc Brown, who's kind of crazy, but he has invented a time machine out of a DeLorean car. Their test goes well, but before they can send Doc Brown to the future, they're attacked by terrorists who want their plutonium back from Doc Brown. In the attempt to escape, Marty takes a time machine and ends up accidentally going back in time to the year 1955, and also prevents his parents from meeting as they are supposed to meet. So then it's a race against time as he's trying to get them back together before he's altered time too much and he's erased from existence. So,
yep, that's the main conflicts of the film. It's pretty straightforward in some ways, but they have some pretty interesting twists with it. So I don't think that it's, that's all I'll say for now. Andrew, what did you get based off of the 9-point rating system that we always use to review films on this podcast?
5.75.
Okay. There you go. So, middle of the road, little optimistic,
a little
but
higher
overall
than
pretty solid story.
A little higher than middle of the road.
Well, middle of the road would be like
Avalon?
a 4.5.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, technically
Technically
would you
speaking.
stop with the numbers tonight, dude?
You have to be right.
Okay. So Avalon, what did you get on the 9 point system for this movie?
Got a perfect 7.
Not a perfect 9? What? I mean, a 7's a very honorable number in my opinion. 7's like this is an awesome movie. Not the most amazing movie, of course, but like this is definitely rewatchable, definitely worth seeing again, and we'll get into that today. Andrew, we are a lot closer than I expected. You got a 5.7? Is that 5.75?
Yeah.
Yeah, I got a 5.4. So, and once again, I was at the point with this where it's like, I could be convinced on a couple things otherwise, so I wouldn't be surprised if my rating went up a little bit after this. But honestly, just trying to give credit where I thought credit was due on an initial take on this, I didn't think it deserved above that. So, that being said, you're looking at a 1.5 between me and Avalon, so it's not like we're getting a terrible score overall. The band that we're getting is not that bad. So let's get into it. The opening scene, we're introduced to this character, Marty McFly, and the dismal world that he lives in, aka his mom's an alcoholic, his dad is subservient, and his siblings are losers, and he's in high school. What was your impression of how they introduced us to the film and to Marty McFly in particular, Avalon?
I honestly really appreciated the opening sequence this time around. That's because it's like such a slow shot of like Doc Brown's internal dwelling, and it just gets stranger and stranger as you start to notice the different, like, from the clocks then to the gadgets and like just to the mess and the unkemptness of everything, and then you get the like news broadcast of like possible plutonium stolen, and it ends with Marty coming in and you see the plutonium under the bed. So it's just like you see all these like little things. It's just like this slow, like gradual, like build up. But as far as like Marty McFly, I love how they introduced him, like with his love of music, his relationship with Doc, and just how his family life is, just between his parents, how his life is at school and his girlfriend. No, I appreciated how they brought everything in focus and showed us what his life was like. So.
Yeah.
And also how they showed he was not a perfect character too. Like how he is like someone who like in a way takes after his father, though we don't know this at that point in the movie, where it's like he's like doesn't want to fail, I guess. Like he's afraid of failing. So he doesn't try.
I kind of break the opening into two sequences because you have the whole intro where he's at Doc's house and he goes to school, he's talking to his girlfriend, and then you have when he's at home and you are introduced to a lot more characters then. And I guess you kind of have like a third opening act where you're introduced to Doc Brown. But like, I don't know, it's done in such a way that it doesn't feel so broken up. The transitions in this movie are very smooth. It's not like you're jumping from place to place, so I appreciate that. I think having seen the movie already, being able to watch the opener, there's a lot more you'll pick up on than if you haven't seen it already. Just like little tidbits that are thrown in there, especially at the beginning, like the plutonium, the news articles, the news channel, all that. Just little tidbits they put in there. And if you are paying attention, or you're a person that does pay attention in movies, as I know there are many who do not, but if you do pay attention during movies, there's a lot of things you can pick up on early on that will make the rest of the movie pretty fulfilling, because you can go, oh, that's already been foreshadowed, that's been foreshadowed. So there's lots of foreshadowing in that sense. And I do appreciate the way they introduce the characters. Marty, right off the bat, is introduced as having his flaws. Like, his flaws are pretty much introduced right out the gate, and they build off of them as the movie progresses. So
you want to delve more into what you saw in him and what you saw that was really like struggling as a character?
The thing for Marty, and you get this, and again, you have to be paying attention to the details, because there are lines of dialogue that are repeated by both of them unintentionally by each individual person. And so one of those lines of dialogue is after Marty gets rejected for the band, he says, I don't know if I could handle that kind of rejection. And then later on in the movie, Marty is confronted by, or George McFly is confronted by Marty about his writing, and he says, why don't you publish it? Why don't you show people? He said, I don't know. I just don't think I could handle that kind of rejection. And for Marty, it's that moment where he realizes, holy crap, I am a lot more like my dad than I realized. I just react to it differently. And the reason I bring up George is because Marty and George are driven by almost like literally the exact same like motivation. And that motivation is this fear of failure. The difference between the two characters is that they react to this fear of failure completely differently. Marty's reaction to this fear of failure is to confront everything in life head on, grabbing the bull by the horns. He has a complete lack of self control, and he's a complete slave to his impulses. Whereas George McFly doesn't face his fears at all. He hides in cowardice, and he refuses to take responsibility for anything whatsoever, and basically hides away in his own mind, in his own home, and doesn't speak or associate with anyone. So in terms of flaws, that I think that's interesting, and I think it's neat that they did that with the dad, because it also helps with Marty's character development later on in the movie.
Actually, I was going to bring that up in my notes. I didn't say that, but I'll bring it up now. But you do see a very similar character arc between George McFly and Marty McFly. They kind of have the same beats for their character arc throughout the movie. I mean, it is different, as you said, but like they kind of come to the same conclusion by the end of the movie. So
Marty, actually just to play the devil's advocate.
Here we go.
Let's just say Marty McFly is not what you say it is. Make the case that he is a mirror of his father, and maybe give more examples. I think that example is interesting, Andrew. Is there, obviously you indicate there's more in your repertoire there. What else are you thinking specifically for him?
I think for Marty, a lot of what he goes through is shown earlier on in the film, because once he goes back in time, he's kind of taken out of his own home situation, and it's more him observing his dad from a top-down view. And you get you kind of get his hot-headedness a lot more in this portion of the movie. It's the earlier portion where you see his fear of failure coming out. And like his fear of failure also falls a lot into his own personal image. Whereas with George McFly, his image isn't as important as Marty's, but you get that a lot even throughout the movie. And that's one of the reasons why Marty is so impulsive, and why anytime someone calls him a chicken, he gets pissed off, and it's like his trigger word. And so because his image is so intimately connected to his fear of failure, it's one of the reasons he's so trigger happy, because he sees a bad image as basically an essence of failure. And so when he fails in terms of that, getting the spot with that band competition, that's one portion of it. It's another portion of it, like his dad. He sees his dad as an extension of his image. And so that's why he gets so upset when his dad isn't standing up to Biff. It's like, it's not him who isn't standing up to him, but his dad won't do it. And like maybe it's one with the car. You can see these frustrations with like his family image too, when he's talking to his family. Like you get this sense of like he's almost disgusted with who his family members are and how they haven't gone anywhere in life, and how that reflects poorly on him. And then you get that later on, like in his demeanor and the way that he carries himself in the past when he goes back there, even though it's much less so, because honestly, I think it's more his image is not really all that. It's not like as important to him as it is from his time period, because it's not as intimately connected to who he is when he's in a different time.
Right.
Just a side note, the whole chicken thing doesn't happen until the second movie. But I mean, it does play to the. I see what you're doing and how it plays to his character, but that doesn't happen in this movie.
Yeah, I mean, there are still instances where he does get triggered by characters, but yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Avalon, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Avalon.
I mean, like, in a way, he's like, he has dreams. He clearly has a direction he wants to go in life, clearly. But at the same time, he is impacted by his family. He doesn't see, and maybe at the beginning of the movie, he doesn't see how much of it is entwined, like how much of it comes, how much he's like his father and things. But like, you see how he's like, after he's rejected once, he starts to think, maybe I'm not cut out for music. Maybe I shouldn't consider this. Like, and his girlfriend's trying to pep him up, but then he's like distracted by other things, and he's like talking about the truck instead. And then when he gets home, like, you see he's like disgusted with his family because of how like, I mean, you kind of see how his father is like a weak person, doesn't stand up to his supervisor, to Biff, how his mom is just like an alcoholic and living in the past in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just like you see his reaction to these things, and they're relatable actions in a way. Because I mean, we've all been disgusted by people, and sometimes even our own families. Where like we'll see someone who just like disgusts us, and like we don't want to be like associated with them. And in some ways,
don't hit me that hard.
I wasn't talking about you, but okay.
I'm just kidding. Anyways, yeah, no, I get what you're saying. Keep going.
But and then it just like, but at the same time, it's just like in this movie, like you see later on, where it's like he goes back to the past and he sees like his father saying the exact same things he was saying early on in the movie, and he begins to see that he's very much like his father, and and I think there are ways in which these people who just bring it back to the point of how some of our family members or people we don't like disgust us or whatever. Sometimes if we look close enough at those people, we find that they're similar, way more similar to us than we like to think. And maybe that's what disgusts us.
Right. Is in the disgust we actually are reflecting a bit of ourselves that we actually dislike. Sure. Yeah. No, I think that this discussion, and part of you might be looking at this saying why are we even talking about this? This doesn't matter. Clearly he's a flawed character. My initial approach of this film is that Marty McFly's not a flawed character. I don't think that in regards to main characters that I've seen, he's pretty much the knight in shining armor. He's the good guy who's doing all the right things, who's got the right attributes going for him, who's just stuck in an unfortunate situation with a family that frankly sucks, right? And that's the reason that he's in a position of somewhat quote-unquote squalor. And I don't think him as a character generally is fairly compelling. I think everything else about the situation is incredibly compelling. The situation he's put in, the doctor and everything about time travel, his family and losing the ability to even exist because his mom falls in love with him because he is that knight in shining armor, right? All of these things I think are incredibly compelling aspects of him as a character, the story as a whole, but him himself is almost too good to be true. Now, that being said, hearing what Andrew had to say and what you had to say about him being a hot-headed individual, I don't think that's wrong. And so you could say that's a flaw. I think that is a flaw. It feels still in some ways very stock. And so I think that in some ways this will raise my rating. I think that is a flaw.
Actually, I'm starting to realize what you're saying now. I didn't understand what your point was before, but now you're saying I see the point.
My point is that there are compelling aspects around the rest of the attributes of him as a character, right? He has a compelling motive for being involved in the plot. He has compelling obstacles in the way of him being in the plot. It continues to get worse, I would even say, in regards to heightening the tension as the plot goes on. But him himself, as a character, is kind of just a character flung into this situation, having to deal with it. But his intrinsic attributes as a person don't make the situation any more compelling. That's what I would argue. I do think that the ideas of him and the mirroring of him and his father, right, and how he deals with the same situation in a very different way, I think that's an excellent point. So I will say this movie will get more points from me for that, specifically because, yes, hot-headedness generally isn't a positive attribute. It's a negative attribute. It's something that you do that you probably shouldn't do. You rush into situations, right? Is that compelling? Does it make him very relatable? It feels pretty stock in my opinion, so I'm going to say no. But if you guys want to convince me otherwise, feel free. Otherwise, we can continue on with further points on the conversation.
No, you're a lost cause. Let's move on. No.
Okay, well, so Dr. Emmett Brown, your boy, Mr. Brown, sir, is hanging out in a parking lot like a sketch dude and just living the dream, right? Making rando, cool-looking cars that have the eagle wings go off into the sunset to only reappear a minute into the future. What was your impression of the introduction of the Doctor, and then his relation to Marty McFly, and then compelling everyone into the story that we then have today.
Well, technically, that's not his opening, like, the first time we see Dr. Emmett Brown. I mean, it is the first time we see him, but it's not the first time we've, like, met him. Because we actually hear him clearly over the phone when he's talking to Marty at the beginning of the movie. And we're given, like, some aspects of his, like, crazy character in, like, that opening phone call. Where it's, like, he's, like, doing something secret, and, like, he's, like, clearly, like, he wants him to meet at 1 o'clock in the morning in a parking lot, which is just weird. And then all his clocks go off, and he's apparently they're all 25 minutes behind time. And so it's just like, we're given a clear example, like, clear image, like, even without seeing him, that this is a weird, like, crazy person who does weird experiments all the time. And is always doing something just strange.
Yeah, no, he's definitely clearly off his rocker, right? He's not fully there in some ways. He's got a couple problems, but he's very intent on making an impact on the future by these experiments that he's doing. And that's where you get the DeLorean thing. He's got his knack for, fancy looks, where he's like, oh, the DeLorean is a cool looking car. Let's use that for our experiments, right? And all of these different things.
If you're going to travel through time, why not go in style?
Exactly. That's his line. So that's how you get introduced to this character. And he's the compelling character that you see for the Doctor, and that's how you get the aspect of Doc Brown. Now, that being said, they more or less exit him from the film pretty early when they're like, hey, now you're dead.
Well, I mean, it is where he dies, but it's more like, it's not where he exits the film, because we go back in time, and then he's brought back as younger self. So... True. I mean, if anything, it's just like a consequence of the future that we will have to Marty's going to have to deal with at some point, where it's like, he's going to go back to the future, and Doc is going to be dead. So does he want to go back to the future, or does he want to alter time and, like, try to prevent Doc's death? So...
Right. Well, and that's not intentionally what he's trying to do, but it does become a side question of the story very early on of, can you change the future by going back in time, right? This is an age-old question, right? From, if you had a time machine and you could go and kill Hitler as a child, would you do it, right? That's those kinds of questions. It's like, oh, can you change the past by going into the past? Like, there's those kinds of things that happen all the time, and this poses that in the form of, oh, well, it assumes that you can because he goes back in time and stops his parents from meeting each other. Now, the space-time continuum then gets drawn into question by even doing that, but, anyways, what are your initial thoughts when he gets sent back in time and he breaks Mr. Peabody's barn and then goes off back into Hill Valley back in 1955?
Oh, when he destroys the barn, I thought that was hilarious.
I think I'm going to bring this up now because there's two kind of overall themes of this movie, or questions, if you will, or ideas. I'd say number one is, can you change the future? And I think the movie gives an answer, its own answer to that. And the second one has to do with facing your fears and how ought we to confront our fears or problems that we're confronted with. And they kind of are connected in some ways throughout the movie, but I put them separately because there are some things that don't quite go hand in hand for both of those ideas. And the question of, can you change the future, is the beginning of that answer happens with this scene when he runs over one of the Twin Pines. And they don't confirm whether or not that changes the future, but at the end of the movie, when he goes back to Twin Pines Mall, it's now called the Lone Pine Mall, thus confirming that your actions can indeed change the future. And so it's right with this scene, actually, where they begin to answer that question for the audience.
That's always a good call out. I did not catch that one.
I didn't either. That's a good one.
Yeah, I think that it definitely is. I mean, it's a core question of the film, right? And so you see that even from the picture, which this is a big theme, I guess, of all of the Back to the Future things of, okay, you can change the past, you can change the future, blah, blah, blah. Like, what are you doing to do that, and how does that impact things? So this first one for sure introduces that head on, even in the small things, and it does that pretty well. In regards to heightening the tension for Marty McFly, and it's kind of hard to have this discussion, right? Especially because so much of what he does is related to the other characters. We already discussed George briefly. Part of that is because out of the goodwill, being that knight in shining armor that I referenced earlier, he's going to make sure his dad's okay and as he's figuring things out, he sees his dad's about to get hit by a car and pushes his dad out of the way to save him. Turns out this was the fateful day that his dad met his mom, and they end up falling in love and going to the dance in the future. Instead, now it is Marty McFly who's in the position of being the knight in shining armor Calvin Klein, who is going to go to the dance with Lorraine. In regards to making the situation like a compelling one that pushes people into the plot, what did you think of introducing all of that?
One, I just want to make a side note of this. Having your wife marry you just because your dad hit you with a car is so emasculating. And it just goes to show how completely pathetic George McFly is. And you even get, I think it's ironic because Marty has this sort of disgust for his family, but even his siblings, which he has disgust for, have their own disgust for their parents. Because their mom's telling them the story, and they're like, "We know the story, Mom. Grandpa hit him with the car." I don't know how the grandpa didn't see him fall out of the tree first, but we're not going to ask that question. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt. And
maybe he was reading the newspaper in his car or lighting his cigarette.
Well, even Michael J. Fox believes this, and he will continue. To this day, talks about this. His mom falling in love with him is just weird. And even Michael J. Fox talking about acting out these scenes, he said it felt weird to be acting a character whose mom was hitting on him. Specifically him sitting in her bed in his underwear. Yes, it's hilarious, but gosh, that'd be so uncomfortable.
I don't think anyone wants to be in that situation.
She's so aggressive.
Well, that's the irony, right?
Yeah,
the whole thing is that she's saying, "Oh, I didn't hit on boys when I was a younger girl," and the whole thing is she is all over a boy as soon as she can get him, right?
Yeah,
and that's part of the thing too, is that it makes sense how George and Lorraine fall in love when in fact they're both just desperate teens looking for love in the midst of their individual lives, and so when he falls out of the tree and gets hit by a car and she sees a helpless man to come in and, save, I guess, they both fall for it and they both lead into their future lives. So you see that in some ways they quote unquote deserve each other, but in other ways it's like, oh gosh, how did we get into this situation? Well, here you are.
Fun fact,
Nice.
His name was actually supposed to be Marty McDermott.
What the heck?
What?
Also, the movie was supposed to end with a nuclear explosion and not the clock tower.
Oh, yeah, no, that was, initially in the script, it was supposed to be a nuclear explosion. And that was how they were supposed to go through time.
They're just going to raw dog it with a nuclear bomb. Send them to the future.
But they didn't have the budget for that kind of thing, so they had to do something simpler, and so they chose the lightning strike, so... much simpler to do.
That is the thing that limited them, was that it was a budget issue that kept us from a nuclear bomb, not the fact that radiation would probably obliterate the people in this.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's exciting. We have gotten way off course at this point. Where are we?
We are discussing...
Why don't we do this? Why don't we
try at the Pine Tree Mall?
Why don't we try to complete
Peabody's Farm?
Yes. No. We're done with that.
Okay.
Let's try to complete Marty McFly's arc, and then we'll move on to the side characters. How about that? So, Marty McFly, he's trying to make things better, but in the process, he actually in some ways makes things worse because now his mom is convinced that he is a dreamboat of a man, the knight in shining armor that she's always dreamed of marrying, and she wants to go with him to the dance. And he's just there saying, crap, I'm going to disappear from the future because my mom is in love with me. And then you get the whole scene with him and her, and then Biff, etc., etc. Take it away, Avalon. What are your impressions on the developments of Marty McFly, the conclusion of his character arc? What are your thoughts on him?
I mean, because like this whole time, he is under pressure, where it's like he didn't intend to use a time machine to go back to the past, and then he discovers incidentally, with Doc Brown, that there's only one chance he has to go back to the future through this lightning strike on the specific time, the specific day. So it's like, but at the same time, he's going to fade from existence if he doesn't get his parents back together. So it's like he's got two things he's got to do, and that's a lot of pressure to put on him. Where it's like this, but first, like, so it's like he's trying to make things work, trying to get his parents together, and like as you said, things are failing, and like his actions are making her like him more, not the reverse. And every time he tries to get George to approach her, George fails and like kind of shuts up, and so that they try to devise this plan where he's gonna interrupt them and like Marty and Lorraine and like save her. Though there's questions like if you think about it too hard, like would that have even worked based on what was going on between Lorraine and Marty at that point? Would that have even like I feel like that would have backfired. So in a way, Biff showing up at that point in the movie was actually kind of a godsend, where it's like, okay, where it's like one person that George could save her from actually like and make her like change her opinion on George. In a way, like you see him change, like his opinion of his parents change just a little bit over the course of the movie. Like he comes to care for them a little bit more. He isn't like repulsed by them. Like by the end of the movie, by the time he goes back to the future, like you see his opinions of them has changed. He doesn't see them in the same way anymore.
Sure, and to be fair to the story that they're telling, they also indicate that they themselves have changed through the process of this because they have become better people, right? It's not just that Marty has a better understanding of his parents, but also that his parents themselves have gone through their own character arcs, which we'll get to in a minute, that has changed them to be better people. So, yeah. Anyways, did you think that his transformation was compelling?
I would say, well, I mean, now that I'm thinking a little bit more, what you said about him being a stock, I could definitely see a little bit more of that now as I'm like thinking about it more. Like there are some ways he is more stock. Now I do think the second and third movie help improve Marty's image quite a bit. Like he's not so stock, but in movies 2 and 3, like he actually is a little bit more unique. In this one, there's less to go off of because he's like the driving like force, like as you said, the knight in shining armor, kind of like the driving force keeping things moving. He's like we empathize with him because we see the problem, we see what he's under,
right?
And we want him to succeed because they're like he's like generally a good guy. We don't want to see him like disappear from existence. Like no one would want to see that.
Sure.
So. Like, I mean, we are given a compelling reason to follow him, to see he succeeds, but as a character in and of himself, like, he does change a little bit, because you see, like, he does do the second song at the dance, and, like, he clearly has, like, you see him, like, taking, like, I don't know, like, you see the way he handles that indicates a little bit of character change there, but arguably.
Okay, yeah. What are your thoughts, Andrew?
I think this is going to be probably the biggest point of contention between me and Maverick in this podcast. It's just that I think Marty is a pretty compelling character in terms of his flaws. And one of the reasons why is because on top of him sharing this fear with his dad, you also have this whole internal dialogue that Marty has where he really doesn't want to be his dad. He sees his dad as pathetic, wimpy, basically this lame excuse for a human being. Like he despises who his dad is. He has absolutely no respect for him. he's basically just like, whatever, he's my dad. That sucks. And as the movie progresses, what it does is it humanizes his dad for him because he sees who his dad is and he understands why his dad does the things that he does. And one of the reasons his dad becomes so humanized for him is because his dad has the exact same fear that he does, this fear of failure or rejection. And the difference is that Marty responds to this fear completely differently. And what's interesting, and it isn't like explicitly stated in the movie, but Marty's character is one that looks at his dad and decides, I'm not going to be that person. And so he responds by doing the complete opposite of what his dad does. Instead of being a complete coward, he basically takes every opportunity to prove that he's courageous by confronting his problems in front of everyone, by never backing down from a bully or someone who's in his way. And he does it with his fists. He just charges in head first. And so what he realizes throughout the movie is that, wow, I may respond to my problems differently than my dad, but at the end of the day, I'm exactly the same as him. And what it does is it humanizes his dad for him because now he realizes, wow, if I have no respect for my dad, how can I have respect for myself at the same time? And so I think what Marty's arc is in this movie is not so much him learning necessarily to confront his fear of failure, if you will, or and I think it does that more in the second and third movie. I think more Marty's arc in this movie is basically almost a humanization of his parents. He realizes his parents were once kids exactly like him, and they went through the same exact struggles. They just responded to it differently. And they got where they were in life by the choices that they made. And what it also shows him is his choices in life can get him to that same place, or they can get him somewhere else. And what I think is interesting is the entire movie came from the director reading a yearbook and seeing that his dad went to the same school as him and asking himself that question, would I have been friends with my dad? What kind of person was my dad in high school? Yeah. What would this relationship have looked like? And I think that when you take that into account, I think that they execute this story arc or this relationship they're trying to cultivate between Marty and his dad's younger self very, very well.
And I would agree with that, right? I think with that background, it almost gives a certain amount of hubris to the director or creator of the story just by saying, oh, I taught my dad some things by the end of the story. But, that aside, the whole thing about him humanizing his relationship with his dad, I think is 100% correct, right? You can't deny that Marty McFly has a understanding of both him and his father and his mother's relationship, where they came from, who they were as high schoolers, and all of that leading into the future of where he is, and understanding the good and the bad that they came from, right? And so respecting that for sure is definitely an aspect of this film. I don't necessarily agree that the arc that you displayed to its full extent exists, partially because I just frankly don't see it. I don't see that he has this whole arc of, if I can't respect my father, how can I respect myself, actually exists in this film. I don't see that, but maybe if you give some examples, you'd be able to compel me. But yeah, the general arc is definitely there. I think that's undeniable. So I definitely think, but that's part of the thing about this film too, is that I personally think the side characters in this film are incredibly compelling. Incredibly. I think George McFly is incredibly compelling. I think Lorraine's compelling. I think the Doctor is compelling. And that's because they each have very compelling things going for them, right? In some ways, George McFly wants love, but he also wants respect, right? He wants to be treated like a decent human being. There's a sense in which Lorraine wants love. There's a sense in which the Doctor, Emmett Brown, wants to be famous. He wants to leave his mark on the world, right? And those are all different inspirations, aspirations, goals, and dreams they have for themselves, but they're all relatable in some way. We can see those and say, oh, that's something I could see myself wanting, right? All of us want to be remembered. All of us want to have respect. All of us wants to see love in our lives. And so the idea that each of these characters embody and represent those in some way or another is very relatable. And yeah, they might be in some ways slightly simplistic, but at the end of the day, their motivating factors are deep core motivators for all of us. And so it's not any different or it's completely understandable. So I think that they're very motivating side characters and very compelling side characters, and I think that they lead to a great story as characters. In regards to making the main character more compelling, I would argue less so, but because they engage with the main character who's engaged with the primary conflict, which the primary conflict is very compelling, I think that the story, as I said earlier, is well done. So, anyways, I don't know if you Avalon, have anything to bounce off of that, or Andrew, if you want to respond to that, but those are my general thoughts.
Well, I don't think Marty's character is like major. I mean, if you're gonna like, not that there's a rating scale for like how flawed a character is, like, oh, like they're
Sure.
deeply traumatized or whatever. Like, Marty isn't like a deeply traumatized character. He's just like,
No.
he has like inconveniences and like things he doesn't like about his life that we can relate to, at least in this movie. And admittedly, like, I'm actually of the opinion that I think his character, he does have flaws in this movie. They're just not pronounced and not like exaggerated. They're like subtle and just like throughout the movie, just there in the background, just like we see it in his actions and mannerisms. We like, maybe he isn't like iconic or anything like in this movie per se. I don't know. Like, I'm trying to think like what the word would be for this, but
Well, right. I mean, I think you're actually hitting on a core point for me, is that in regards to the characters in this film, I actually think that Marty McFly is the most forgettable of the characters in this film. I think that Dr. Emmett Brown is far more rememberable. I think that, or memorable, excuse me, or George McFly is more memorable, or you're definitely going to remember Lorraine hitting on her son more than you're going to remember Marty McFly. So it's like these different aspects of the film are actually, I think, far more compelling, and there's a reason that you remember them more.
Well, I mean, I don't, just to be clear, like, I think Marty McFly as a character is memorable and iconic in a way, but I think it's because of the second and third movie. I'm not sure if like you're taking
That
this
might
movie
be
on
true.
its own, like on its own.
I am, for sure.
I'm not sure, like, if you're just gonna judge Marty McFly by his actions and what he does in this movie, I would say maybe he's not as iconic, or like maybe he is a little bit more stock than I like to admit he is. However, I do think I don't think his character is not compelling. I think his character has some compelling traits, and I think the conflicts he goes through has an ounce of like that draws the audience in. Like, he's kind of a character who's thrown into a situation that no one wants to see. As I said before, no one wants to be in that situation. No one really wants to see other people in that situation. So it's like we root for him to succeed, even though he may not be like the most like, even if he is like the most iconic character in this movie, like, we still root for him and we still want to see him win by the end of the movie. We want to see his parents get together, and we want to see him be able to return back to the future. So
right, and to be clear to everyone who's watching this, right, we're talking about, and this is maybe why I think this is in some ways a little silly to continue this discussion, but I think it's interesting, right? But at the same time, we're saying whether or not we think that Marty McFly is a super flawed character, which at the end of the day, if you're looking at the 9 points, that's 0.5 of the whole rating scale. So if you were to take away all points, you're dealing with half a point rating based on whether or not he's flawed, because he still has compelling motive for being involved, right? Which is a big part of the conflict. You still have deals with the antagonizing force, right? You still have deals with the people around him and all the other situations. So whether or not he himself is someone you can relate to and understand is a small portion of the overall issue of, is this a compelling story? And I think, and my point here is that he's not a very compelling character, but the story itself is still compelling and still interesting, that people do want to come back and rewatch it. And I think that in and of itself is an interesting fact.
All right, I have some questions for you specifically, because I want to understand what you're getting at here. What do you think makes a compelling character to the audience, to the viewer? Like, let's just say it's me or some random schmuck off the street. What makes a compelling character?
There's a difference between what I would say is a compelling character and a relatable character, right? So a compelling character integrates several facets of the 9-point rating system, which is why if you were to take all of those things together, you're dealing with a big portion of the rating system, right? And that regards what? The character themselves, who they are, what is their core motivations, their flaws, their strengths, weaknesses, etc. They're antagonizing opponent in some degree because that relates to, is it a physical person? Is it nature? Is it themselves? There's all sorts of different ways to deal with conflict. So all of those things together, probably as a whole, relate to 2.5 to 3 points of the total rating system of this film, of any film actually, underneath the 9-point rating system, because we are following the perspective of someone and seeing their journey. That's what we want to see at the end of the day. And so when we see this film, the question is that compelling? I would say if you take apart each of those sections, a good portion of that still exists in a fairly high rating in this film. But the question itself of, is Marty McFly someone we can relate to as an individual, I would say not so much, because his only thing is that he's hot-headed. Pretty much. Now, you might say, well, I'm hot-headed too, so I relate to that a lot. That might be a personal preference, but at the end of the day, I don't see him as someone who's more than much of a stock hot-headed character. And to be clear, it doesn't necessarily have to fully encompass them having negative traits, right? It can also include them having a core need that is not met. You could try to make the case for that in this movie. I think it's not very compelling because it's pretty basic and also kind of gets thrown by the wayside pretty early on in the film as he gets thrust into a completely different circumstance. But you can make the case for it, right? He wants to be a starstruck singer or musician.
I very strongly disagree with this. I think Marty is a very compelling character because he isn't. Here's the thing.
Because you're a hot-headed just like him.
No, that's not why. Although that may be true.
He's my hero.
Because you have to ask yourself, at least in my mind, when I think what makes a compelling character, there are a couple of things. Mm-hmm. The two primary things you have to ask yourself is this character relatable and are they flawed? I think Marty is both of those things. And then you have to ask yourself, does this character learn something throughout this movie? Because if they don't learn anything, even if they're relatable and they're flawed, why are we watching this movie? They're not compelling as a character because they're exactly the same throughout the movie. So I think those are 3 key points. I think Marty fulfills all of these because, one, he's flawed. He has this massive fear of failure that comes out. He has this disdain for his dad. He doesn't want to become this parent, who his dad is. And throughout the movie, he realizes, I am my dad. And as much as I don't want that to happen, now I have to confront this fear of failure. But the way I've been doing it is basically just the same as what my dad's doing. Then you have to ask yourself, is Marty's character relatable? Marty is like the quintessential high schooler in the sense that he himself doesn't see his flaws, but as the viewer, you can kind of pick up on them. And he isn't like overtly, like he isn't like the bully or the jerk in high school. He's kind of the, I don't really give a crap kind of kid. Like he's just a normal average.
He's a slacker.
Yeah, he's just a slacker. And he doesn't care too much about his high school diploma or what happens to, like, in terms of his academics. He's just kind of here. He cares more about his girlfriend and his music and hanging out with Doc Brown. And then you have to ask, thirdly, does Marty develop in this movie? Now, while I don't think Marty's character arc is completed in this movie, I think he still develops. And so if I'm taking any points away from Marty's character, it's going to be on whether or not his character actually fully completes an arc, and not on whether or not he's compelling in terms of, is he flawed or is he relatable?
Your big concern was that maybe he did, maybe he didn't learn something. That's the biggest thing that is in your mind as a question mark, right?
Yeah. It's whether or not Marty truly evolved as a character and whether or not his interactions throughout the first movie kind of aided in his character development. And I think they did. I just don't think it's as pronounced as the later movies or as well as it could be, I guess. Although I think it's interesting because a lot of his lessons kind of come really, really late in the movie, and then the movie just kind of wraps up really rapidly. So there's not really an opportunity to show that character development, if you will.
I don't know if they initially planned this to be 3 parts. I'd be like 3
they did
movies.
Not. No,
I think they.
Yeah.
No, I don't think they did. I think this was just supposed to be a first movie, and then they did 2 more.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to keep that in mind as I'm formulating my thoughts. But so I mean, as far as the character, like obviously the big drive of this movie is clearly the like interactions between Marty McFly and his parents. Clearly, like that's the core of this movie. Like how if we met our parents when they were our age, what would that look like? Like, what would that relationship be? Would we be friends? Would we not be? Like, clearly that is the focal point of this whole movie. So while there is character development, I think, on Marty's part, it's in context of that relationship, in the context of, like, interactions between him and his mom, him and his dad, and, like, his attempts to bring them together. So now it doesn't give him, because he's also in this particular movie, I mean, compared to the other two, the plot device, like the motive driving him forward is getting them together. Like, it's completely focused on that. And so it doesn't really give a lot of time for, like, personal, like, growth. Personal, like, I don't know. He's not, like, working on his own needs, per se, in the past. Like, his need is to get back home to his own time and to make sure he still exists. So it's like, it's all wrapped up in these two plots that are going on at the same time. Like, the subplot of the time machine, like, getting ready for, like, this big experiment, like, getting the lightning bolt into the time machine at the right moment. And making sure his parents, like, fall in love and, like their relationship gets back on track that he accidentally derailed. So, like, as you said, I would agree that there's not a whole lot of character development. I still think it's there. It's just not, I mean, his character is... Well, here are my personal thoughts. I think Marty McFly, in a way, in the first movie, like, I think the directors were, like, Robert Zemeckis, the director, I think he was trying more or less to make Marty McFly a, like, mirror for the audience. Like, not drawing his character out too much so the audience can kind of see themselves in Marty McFly a little bit. And now, I have seen discussions, and there are, like, arguments online about make that kind of character, like, creating the character who's, like, supposed to be a mirror for the audience, is like, because it's not really a fully developed character, but you can develop the character and make them unique and different. I think, personally, Marty McFly has a little bit of this, because the point is to, because it is, like, that is the core of the movie, like, the parents and the, like, meeting your parents back in their time. Now, obviously, the second and third movie, they decided to branch out and, like, develop Marty more and, like, give him his own unique character and who he is a little bit more.
I think that's probably enough to get the idea of what you're saying, right? And between the two of you, I think that you actually... I think that's really interesting, and I think that that's a good perspective to take, which in some ways reinforces... Well, I actually think it reinforces my opinion more than it reinforces Andrew's, but I'll explain why.
I don't see that, but okay.
Sure. So here's what I think is that, like, there's a sense in which, first off, the ideas of this character of Marty McFly, and I can't believe we're still talking about this, but clearly this is the point of contention here. So the idea that Marty McFly, as a high schooler, has all these ideas of being this indifferent guy in high school who basically just wants his girlfriend and wants to do his music and then whatever. To a certain degree, you might say, sure, that is at least presented in this film, right? And part of that is this is a very tight film, right? It has very quick succession of ideas. But that idea is frankly not really developed in this film because, as you said, Avalon, they introduce the ideas and then throw this guy into the past, and all of these ideas of his present situation kind of get thrown by the wayside. Why? Because the main question of this film is not whether or not Marty McFly is a relatable character. The main question of this film is, would you be able to be friends with your parents when you were in high school if you were at the same time as them, right? And so that takes all of Marty's concerns and makes them irrelevant. So, when you get taken to this current situation, right, whether or not these questions that Andrew's posing about reading into Marty McFly's character, which I think he was, but let's just say that he wasn't, whether or not that you're reading into those attributes of him and his flaws in this story is kind of irrelevant because they get all shoved away when you deal with the past. And the question of the past is, what is going on here between him and his parents? And those are the relationships that get developed there. Now, that being said, I think that that is a very interesting discussion to be had, and that's the main discussion that we're having here. And I think that that, as a whole, is why we see the side characters in this film are incredibly compelling, right? Because they develop them there very thoroughly. While you see that George is a very insecure individual, doesn't want to venture out. He has all these aspirations. He has all these dreams, but he's also incredibly flawed, right? Same thing for Lorraine. And into some degree, same for the Doctor. So, and that goes back to what even you said just now, Avalon, about the idea of Marty McFly being a template for all of us to reflect off of. And there's a sense in which he is simply a good individual existing in society so that all of us can attribute to him what we will. We don't have a lot of things to say, oh, well, clearly he's flawed in this way and I'm not flawed in that way, so I can't relate to that. Or this person is flawed in this way, so we can relate to that, right? There's none of that, and so we start reading into it of what we can or cannot attribute to him, and he's tabula rasa, he's blank slate. He's simply a chalkboard to then draw onto it what you will of yourself, then relating to your parents. And that's how you're able to easily engage with them as very relatable side characters even more. And maybe there's a discussion to be had about, okay, if you have a blank slate character, can you then reflect yourself and relate to the side characters better because of that, right? That might be an interesting discussion to have. I haven't fully thought that through. I can't say right off the top of my head whether or not that would be, but as you indicated, there might have been thorough discussions on that online, so that would be worth viewing for you as a listener.
Well, it is a trope in storytelling where it's like you'll see it in certain stories where it's like the blanks, like almost the main character is like not really fully developed. But that's because they're a blank slate. Like you can see in the way the story's written, like they're clearly like the audience is supposed to project onto that character and like almost in a way live through that character's actions in the story. So it's like, and they're not usually as well developed or as unique in some ways. Not that they can't be. In fact, some of them I think have some interesting unique traits or as things that like make them stand apart from others. And that's why I maybe differ a little bit. Where I think Marty McFly does differ from the standard run of the mill like stock character. I think he does stand out. Because he's not your like. I mean, even though he's a slacker, he's not a like lazy or anything necessarily. He's just like doing all sorts of stuff, and he's like. And as Andrew said, he's impulsive. Whereas like he does like all sorts of like he runs on impulse and he's like trying all these things out. And maybe even getting in trouble. Well, and so
and that's why I feel like he's somewhat stock, because they have these, in my mind, fake flaws where yes, he's a slacker, but at the same time he's very proactive about things in his life. And yeah, he's bullheaded in some ways, but at the same time he confronts the problems in his life pretty proactively. And so these ideas are all ideas of someone who's idealistic, someone who faces the problems in front of them rather than having severe flaws. And once again, as I've said twice or three times on this podcast, we're talking about a minute aspect of the rating system. This doesn't affect it that much. But I still think that he's not that flawed as a main character, and all of the points that you guys are making I actually think support this more, which is why when you say, oh, it's reflected in his dad, right? That's the whole point, is that we're focused on his dad, the side character in the story, not him, because the question, like you said, is would we be friends with our parents if we met them in high school? And that's where I just think I'm going to leave it. That's where I'm going to leave it. I don't know what you guys want to say. Andrew, you guys can feel free to rebuttal.
Andrew, we haven't convinced him. We need to go round 4.
I mean, at the end of the day, I don't think we're going to convince Maverick. But for you viewers out there, Maverick's a picky guy. Why he's decided to pick on Marty McFly, I don't know why. But
oh, crap. Stupid green screen.
He decided that Biff didn't get a go, so he stooped that low. Now let's move on. Because me and Avalon have made our case, and yeah, I think you can take what we've said and kind of, there's not much more we can do going back and forth.
We've stated some of our points like 4 times.
We've beat this dead horse more than Biff has beat George McFly, so.
Right. And so getting to the end of the
Does that make us bad people?
Looking at seeing George and you see Lorraine, and we've discussed them to some degree, I'll give you guys a chance to fully explain them if you want to more here at the end, and then we'll get to the Doctor. But right here at the end, you see that their arcs are completed. You see that they've changed as people, right? They become better people. And you see Marty McFly reflecting on that. And I guess my last point on this would be, that's the point, is that you don't see that Marty McFly actually changed. You see that his parents were the ones that changed, and that's what he sees at the end of the film. But at the end of the day, you see that Lorraine has changed a lot as character. George McFly has changed a lot as a character. They become better people because of the journey they went through in the middle of this film. What are your thoughts on that arc for Lorraine and George? And if you want to go back to Marty, feel free.
I mean, it's quite obvious in like Lorraine and George McFly's case, or it's like you see what they are. Like when you go back to the past, you first meet them, you see who they are as characters, and then when you get, and like even like before you go back to the past, you see what they are, what they become based on what the past originally was. Then you go back in time and you see what they are as kids, and then we go to the end of the week and like we see how George learns to stand up for himself, fights against Biff. We see how he stands up for what he wants. We see Lorraine begin to see that, we see how Lorraine kind of changes and like she starts to appreciate, she decides to go with George and doesn't like become infatuated with Marty anymore.
I'm gonna be honest. I don't think Lorraine changes as a character much in this movie. Lorraine's character.
Oh, hot take.
What does she want in the beginning? She wants a boy. She's like boy crazy. And so the first boy that walks in their house, ooh, what does his underwear say? Calvin Klein must be his name, and it's purple, and I'm going to grab his thigh aggressively in a way that only a sexual predator would. But that said, by the end of the movie, throughout the entirety of the movie, she's still infatuated with Marty. Like, that is the person she goes to. And she has no real justification for it initially, other than that Marty fell in front of her parents' car. And then kind of like as the movie goes on, she kind of becomes more and more infatuated with him as he does these impressive feats. Why does she fall for Biff? She falls for Biff because Biff lays out, or not Biff, sorry, George, because George lays out Biff. It's not because of like some immutable quality that wasn't there before. It's just because now he is involved in her life in a way that matters to her, I guess. And it's almost instantaneous too. Like there's no like progression in their relationship. It goes from, I think he's kind of giving me an ick, to, oh my gosh, my knight in shining armor, I will kiss you at the dance and you will take me home and we will live happily ever after. And so I mean, yes, you get to see Lorraine's development because you jump forward like 30 years, but in the moment, there's not really any progression for her character in the time frame that the movie is taking place in.
I think that's kind of a weird argument, frankly, because the ending of the film where they jump up 30 years is part of the story.
If you're going to argue that doesn't count,
I don't think you can.
Then I'm going to say
I'm arguing that does count.
If you're going to argue that counts,
that's the point.
Then, well, boys, we got him, because then it counts for Marty McFly too. Because Marty McFly's character should be able to develop just as much as her character did.
Yeah, how does he develop by the end of the film? Because
the entire purpose of his development was to humanize his parents. As a character, it doesn't... They've always been humans, my guy. They've always been there.
I understand that. That's the whole... But what I'm saying is that for you as a perspective, right, that is all development of the characters that are the side characters. That is related to development of Lorraine and of George. That's not related to Marty's development as a character.
Yes, it is. Look. Let me explain this. Okay? Beginning.
Am I stuck in a time loop? I feel like we're going around in circles.
Let me just finish with this. Okay. Marty at the beginning of the movie wants nothing to do with his family. He absolutely despises them. As the movie progresses, they become humanized, not just to the viewers, but to Marty himself. And that's why at the end of the movie, when he sees his family again, it's a totally different perspective from his point of view. He is happy to see them again. He's happy to see his parents, and he's happy to see them happy. His whole character's paradigm has shifted as an individual. That is the change that has happened. It's the same shift that happened, by the way, with all of the other characters. All that happened with every character in this movie was a paradigm shift. Okay?
Agree. A paradigm shift did occur. I disagree with your reading into what happened to Marty McFly at the end of the film, because literally the end of the film isn't Marty McFly doing anything. The end of the film is Marty McFly literally experiencing the last 20 years or whatever of existence, like basically catching up to him. And he just sees, oh, my parents have a good relationship now. Oh, my brother is actually a respectable man. My sister is a respectable woman. And I walk outside and wow, look at these cool gadgets I've been gifted with. I have a cool car. Now the professor's over here with a cool time machine. Blah, 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 right? None of that is stuff that he is actively engaging with. And you don't see him saying, oh my goodness, Mom, I love you so much. I changed my mind. I don't hate you guys.
That sounds
He's
cringe,
literally
and
sitting
I'm
there with
glad
his
they
jaw
didn't do that.
open the entire time.
I can't.
He's literally sitting there just jaw dropped the entire
I actually
time,
hope
saying,
he doesn't
what
say
happened?
that.
The idea that Marty McFly is actively engaging positively with his parents, you could argue, sure, that he might be happy that that happened, right? But to argue that he went through a character arc because of that, because he literally looked at his parents, is questionable to say the least.
All right. I don't think that's the only sign that he went through an arc, but I think the fact that I think the whole Johnny Be Good scene is pretty big part of that too, but I think we're beating a dead horse again. But I want to keep beating it because it's getting Maverick riled up.
I thought it was already dead.
I never thought that this film would get me like this.
So that's Lorraine, I will say. Okay, George McFly on the other hand. Just to move this along.
I would agree. But generally, is that Lorraine has a weaker character arc. It isn't to say that it isn't at all exist, right? Because you said by the end of the film she changes somewhat.
Yeah.
But yes, George's is far more.
I'm going to be honest. If you're jumping forward 30 years, it's harder not to develop as a character if you skip 30 years. Like, if you were the exact same person in 30 years, that's kind of absurd. But they can also take a lot more creative liberties by jumping 30 years because obviously you're expecting a different kind of person. But that said, with Lorraine, like, unless you guys have something else to say about Lorraine, I was going to move on to George McFly.
That's fine. That's fine.
Well, the only thing I'll say about Lorraine and maybe George McFly is that, I mean, because at the very beginning of the movie, we're given them, or shown what they are in the present day, or 1985, before we go back to 1955. So, like, we already have a baseline of what they will become. And we can kind of see, based on the initial interactions with them in 1955, how they will become what we've seen in 1985. But, of course, by the end of the week, before he goes back, we see how they've changed as characters in little ways, like, not completely. Like, as you said, Lorraine's character arc isn't that big in the week, like, in that short time span. However, it's enough of a, like, rolling stone that when we jump back 30 years to the like 1985, her character has completely changed what she was, like, what we once knew. Like, both her and George have changed as characters, and, like, they are now completely different people because of how that week changed them.
I think when it comes to George McFly, granted, this is the only movie they really delve into George and Lorraine's characters. Like, second and third movie barely touch on them, really. Like, they kind of end up just becoming collateral damage in the time-traveling shenanigans that occur, rather than really developing their characters.
Right. Because
a lot of the shenanigans end up changing their future selves, not their past selves that have already developed. With George McFly, I think there's a couple of interesting things here. Marty kind of looks at his dad as being weak, as being pathetic, both, like, mentally and physically. And I think what it does when you go back in time, and this is why I think this movie does such a great job with foreshadowing, is they show you that George McFly isn't like a weak person, per se, in terms of, like, at least his physical state. He also isn't mentally weak in that, like, he's stupid. He's mentally weak in that he can't he's unable to confront his fears. He suffers from extreme cowardice.
Right.
And even when like he punches and lays Biff out, it to some people it comes as a shock. If you pay attention to small details in the film, George is kind of made out to be a strong character, even though he doesn't use his strength. There's the first instance I can think of is when he's talking to Marty, and Marty's trying to open a Coke can, and George just kind of grabs the Coke can and just breaks the top off without it any problem at all. And Marty kind of looks at it for half a second, and it's like this 2-second scene that's meant to demonstrate that George McFly is a physically capable individual. He isn't a physical person.
Sure.
I think, anyways, and so George's character, I think, is one that develops pretty well throughout the movie. I mean, I think, despite the fact that I think that Marty McFly is compelling and does develop, I'm not going to argue the fact that I think that George has better arc than Marty does in this movie. And I think that while Marty is the main character, I think George's arc is ultimately the one that everyone's rooting for throughout the movie. I mean, the audience almost kind of, at certain points in the movie, it's almost like they're watching it from Marty's perspective. Which I think is interesting. You know what? You wanna get mad at me? I think that almost any movie can happen like that. So screw yourself.
Okay, just keep going. That's
I lost
fine.
my train of thought because you were being.
We're just gonna pass that on.
Pickle fart. I don't know what you were doing, making faces at me. I think there's some good humor here too. I was looking at like one of the original scripts, and there's a lot longer dialogue when Marty and George are trying to come up with their plan for how to like get George to rescue Lorraine. And I think like the best, in my mind, like one of the best lines in there that really shows like George is a very genuine character. He's not like Marty. Marty is much more like surface level, if you will, in terms of like how he goes about his life. Whereas George, while he does suffer from the same motivation, like core motivation, if you will, he tends to be a much more genuine individual. And like part of that is like when they're talking about him going in there and like him punching Marty, he like tells him to put some emotion into it. And he says, get your damn hands off of her. And he goes, you really think I should swear? And it's like, he's trying to figure all this stuff out, and that's what he's worried about. And like the fact that the thing that motivates him to actually go and like figure out how to get Lorraine to come to the dance is Marty dressing up in like his spacesuit and saying he is Darth Vader from the planet Vulcan. It's so weird and chaotic, but George like completely falls for it. So anyways, those are my thoughts on George. I don't really have any problems with George's character overall. Like, as he develops his motivations, what drives him, his flaws.
Yeah, no, and I'm not going to add anything to that because I 100% agree with you on that. I think that George is amazing.
Yeah, I do think also what's interesting
character.
about George is that everything George accomplishes in the movie, he accomplishes on his own. Like, Marty is kind of trying to help George, and Marty feels like he needs to be there to push him along, but ultimately George is the one who does all of those things on his own. He's the one that punches Biff. He's the one who stands up to the guy at the dance and ends up taking Lorraine back. And so he ends up taking responsibility for his actions and kind of stepping out of his comfort zone, which was the end of his arc.
It's amazing. It's a great arc, and we're all rooting for him. Almost more than we're rooting for Marty McFly, right? Great. All right, so let's talk about the Doctor, and I think that should just about wrap it up. What are your guys' thoughts on Dr. Emmett Brown throughout the film?
Hold on, I want to hear yours first, because we always go first, and then you get to disagree with us.
Mine?
Yes.
Emmett Brown as a character. Honestly, I actually don't have that many notes on him. I don't think he's like the most compelling thing, but I think that that's part of the point of this film, is what you guys have been saying all along, is that even though this is a time travel story, at the end of the day, it's all about the relationships between Marty McFly and his father and his mother, and the question you guys posed earlier of what would it be like if you were friends with your parents in high school, and would you be friends with them? And so there's a sense in which the Doctor, while he's integral to that story and that conversation, is more or less a conduit and a catalyst for that more than anything else, and that story. So his relationship, there's a certain sense in which even when you see the whole thing with the clock tower, while there is some question that they will or will not get back to the future, as the name implies, the bigger question is, will he even exist in the future? And that's a far more dire question in this film than whether or not he'll actually get back to it. So I think that in regards to his integration to the film, it's a less compelling part of the film. It's an integral part of the film, and because of that, they don't spend less time on him, and that's fine. He's a great character. I enjoy him a lot. He's got a ton of personality. He's super interesting, and he's got great reasons for being involved, right? His idea to make his mark on the world is a great reason to be involved, and I don't need any more than that. The only thing I will add is that the plot twist with him was awesome. That the fact that he actually reads the note when he's so adamantly against it earlier on in the film was a great way to subvert expectations for you as the audience, so that when you see that he actually survived, it's legitimately surprising because you didn't think he would have read the note. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Yeah, I'd love to hear what you guys have to think.
I was gonna say, I just thought of this, but because you have these two plots, like obviously the plot line with his parents is the primary one. Then you have this plot line with the time machine and Doc Brown as a secondary one. But in a way, you see they're kind of reversals of each other, where it's like in the parents one, he's trying to fix time, like he's trying to get their relationship back on course, like fix the damage he's done, like not change the future, but like fix it, like get it back on course. Whereas in the case of Doc Brown, he's dealing with the temptation to change the future because he saw Doc Brown die, and he's like, and it's just like he doesn't want to go back to the future with him dead. So it's like he's trying to figure out how to save his the Doc's life before he gets sent back to the future. And of course, when Doc finds the letter, he gets upset, and he's just like, he doesn't want to hear about the future. He's like, you shouldn't change future events. And so like he rips up the letter in an attempt to like prevent himself from hearing about the future. And then of course, you've already said the plot twist where it's like he put the letter back together and he knows, so he saved, his life is spared at the end.
Right.
So
no, absolutely. Andrew, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, I think Doc Brown his arc is not in this movie. Like, the third movie is very much a movie about Doc Brown.
Obviously, if we're going to talk about this is not about the Back to the Future trilogy. This is just about the first movie. And so, if we want to discuss the other two movies, we're going to have to do 2 other podcasts on those other two. But based on Maverick's reactions, I don't know if we're going to do a second one.
I think that at the end of the day, Doc Brown functions as like the quintessential side character. He has a very straightforward, simplistic motivation that is believable, and he just functions as a force to push the main character forward throughout the film. So in terms of like side characters, I think he does great. I don't think he needs that much to be a good side character. I think that in terms of like the question of like the idea of this fear of failure, I think they kind of try to do small elements of that, because they have like in the current setting, Doc, there's like at the beginning you see all these articles about like, oh, the mansion burned down. He like lost all of his wealth, all this other stuff. And then you go back in time, you see he's actually pretty wealthy. Like he has this inheritance from this long line of people that have lived there. It's like it is not nearly as pronounced as everything else, but I think they're still kind of trying to go for this, like, this idea at the end of the day of like, can you like, let me think of how to phrase this. Like kind of like changing the future, if you will, and this fear of failure. Like there are small elements of that within Doc Brown's character, because he kind of pours his life savings into this DeLorean. And so like when he goes back in time, Doc is kind of more of, all of my inventions suck. Nothing I make works. I'm pathetic. And then he realizes, oh wait, I do make something that works. I'm not a failure. Wow, I'm a genius. I should have learned this sooner.
Right.
Those are my thoughts on Doc Brown.
Cool. So in regards to this film, obviously it's seen as a classic. What do you think about the long-term impacts of this film, the lasting legacy of it? What are your guys' thoughts on that?
So, well, actually, I did have an interesting question about the villain in my notes. So is the villain really Biff? I mean, clearly he's the like antagonist, but is Biff truly the villain of this movie, or is it like the flaws of like George McFly, or is it like time itself, where it's like the because of how the plot plays out, how everything happens, you could arguably say it's like the fate, like destiny, the fate of the world, or is it like even George's failures, like to be a better person?
I actually was thinking of that exact same question, and that was the thing that I was posing to myself: is the main opponent truly Biff, or is it society? Is it nature? Is it himself? I think to a certain degree, the biggest threat to him is time, probably. Or like the forces of nature more or less working against him, trying to stop him from getting back to the future, which is the thing that he's dealing with. And now it gets exacerbated by the actions that he takes, which is what Andrew was alluding to when he says, oh, I have a problem here where I created this issue with my mom and my dad where I accidentally stopped them from meeting by stopping him from being hit by her dad's car. But at the end of the day, that only adds to the primary antagonist to Marty McFly, which is nature being in conflict with him by threatening to cause him to not exist by moving forward in the plot, right? So that was my general impression. I think that it is an interesting take because it's not a common take you see. Most oftentimes you see a physical force of a person in nature or in the storyline, or even a man against himself is even more common. So I think this situation is unique, but that's my thoughts.
So here's why I think that Marty functions as the villain or the antagonist of this movie, and why I think he's a compelling character. Marty's character throughout the entire movie is very self-reliant. He is the person who has to solve the problem. He has to, and throughout the entire movie, it's him who's trying to fix the problem with his parents. When he falls in, and I mean, hold on. I'm trying to think about where I need to start here. Go back to the beginning when he meets his dad. He tries to save his dad by knocking him out of the way of that car. Guess what? His actions started this whole problem to begin with. He intervened with the timeline, basically erased himself from existence. And so he says, okay, now I need to fix this some more. How do I fix it? By getting involved and getting between Lorraine and George. And every time he gets involved and tries to get George to do something, it only makes Lorraine fall in love with him more. Because then he goes and he just has to trip Biff, and then he goes and outruns Biff, and then it just makes himself look better in her eyes. It isn't until he doesn't actually let George. It isn't until George actually does something for himself that the problem resolves itself. Marty is his own worst enemy, and that he is the one who's trying to solve the problems. When you could kind of make the case that if he left things alone, it probably would have fixed itself on its own, to an extent. Granted, he kind of did get Lorraine to go to the parking lot and like get George to show up there, but all of the events that transpired and went the way that they did because of his absence.
Sure. No. I see what you're saying. I think that that's an interesting way to look at it. I generally think that's just the general definition of taking a situation and heightening the tension, right? Taking something and making it bad to worse. But at the same time, you still see it moving along the conflict, right? So you see that his relationship with his father is improving so that his father trusts him to a certain degree more, rather than before he was literally just running away from him, right? Trying to avoid him. You see that the mother is, while at some ways you're like, okay, this is unideal because she's in love with me, at the same time, she is unknowingly being willing to put in this situation where Marty McFly is manufacturing a situation where George and her can fall in love. So you could say that it's like questionable to say whether or not he is his own worst enemy. I think there's a certain degree you can argue that he is, and I'm willing to buy that. Yeah, of course, to some degree, Marty's an idiot and does things that make it worse for himself. But at the same time, it's like, that's maybe not the biggest focus, because this is a time travel movie, and his whole thing is his motivation is he is threatened to exist. So, yeah, I mean, either way you take it, I don't think that's a big.
We'll just go the existential philosophical route, and his worst enemy is time.
That's literally what that's
what you were saying when you were off.
Yeah.
I
was waiting until I gave my whole spiel to say that.
Oh man, sorry, we spoiled it.
Too bad.
Stole my thunder. Rude.
Yeah. Well, good thing we already reviewed Love and Thunder, so we're done with that.
True, unfortunately.
Now, unfortunately, we're at the end of the film. So, in regards to the lasting impact of this film, what do you guys think about it? Obviously, they made 2 more movies, so it had some sort of impact. What are your thoughts, Avalon?
Well, I would say, like, this movie had, I mean, as I said, at the very, very beginning of this podcast, what was it, 3 hours ago? I don't know when we started. But when we started and I gave my initial take, this movie did have an impact on me when I first watched it. And I kind of get, like, when you watch other time travel stories and other movies, it's like you kind of see, like, they harken back to this one. Like, this feels like this movie was a template in some ways, where it's like it kind of set a standard unintentionally for time travel sci-fi. And, like, and now you have this, like, and I don't know, like, I love, in a way, I do love sci-fi, and I love time travel, especially if done right. The problem is it's done wrong so often. But in this case, it's just like this movie is like just the way the story is told, how like the plot thickens, how the tension is like kept up as the movie progresses. It keeps you at the edge of your seat, and it's just you just see how like the movie is just so well done, and it just continues to have an impact today. Like it continues. I watched it and I still like it. It's like it doesn't like aged badly or whatever. I feel like it still is a relatable film for today.
This movie, I haven't shared this yet because I'm trying to be like criticizing the plot. This movie is one of the first movies I was allowed to watch that was like live action. Like I watched Star Wars. This movie for me is like, it's nostalgic. I enjoy it, and I've watched it so many times with my siblings. The reason I'll never forget this movie is because of the scene where he breaks down the barn. And here's why. When he breaks down the barn and that farmer goes out and he like runs over the pine tree, the farmer calls him an SOB. He's like yells at him emphatically. And I remember watching that, and I was like 8 or 9 and thinking that was the funniest thing I'd ever seen. And in my family, as you guys would know, because in your family, you repeat scenes that are funny. Well, I didn't know that saying SOB was a bad word. I thought it was just funny. And so we were in the car after church, and I just repeated the scene to my dad. And I just remember him looking at me in horror, like, what did you just say? And I was just sitting there laughing. And then it took me like 20 seconds because like I realized he wasn't laughing with me. And it was like an awkward silence. And then I learned that day that you don't call people a son of a female dog. Least of all your siblings.
Oh my word.
And thus Andrew's origin story began.
I do enjoy this movie though. It is a movie that's like, if I were, let's just put it this way. There are certain movies.
Wait, you defended Marty McFly for that?
Yes. Just trust me, I like using that word now.
Oh, that's amazing. You know, you can call me that all you want if that makes you say that, you know, Marty McFly is just an okay character, you know, not an amazing character.
Oh my word. We need to do this more often.
There are certain movies where, like, if I have kids or if I am gonna date someone, or if I end up making really great friends with someone, I'm gonna these movies will probably come up at some point. And if they haven't seen them, I'll probably act offended and then say, okay, we need to watch this movie now. Back to the Future is one of those movies.
Right.
Not the whole trilogy, but the first one especially is I probably would want you to have seen this movie if I'm friends with you.
Mm-hmm.
Especially my kids. This will be the movie where I introduce their first bad word. I'm just kidding, Mom.
There you go. Yeah, she's not gonna listen to this podcast anyways. That's Exodus. All right. Yeah, that's it. I don't know what else to say. If you're listening, let us know
would
what
you
your
change the
individual
rating?
thoughts are in. Oh yeah, that's true. I would change the rating actually. I myself would increase the rating from a 5.4 after much thought and discussion. I was thoroughly convinced to increase it to a 5.5. All right,
I was
now what do you guys
convinced to raise mine after that discussion. I convinced myself to raise it to a perfect 9.
Yeah, okay. Shut up, dude.
Wow. Okay. No.
You're so full of it, dude.
You know what? Honestly, my score is staying the same. It's just a 7. I like it where it is.
I'll bring mine up to a 6.
I wasn't
a nice round 6. I actually, after I thought about it more, I think.
I mean, to be perfectly frank, your discussion about Marty made me kind of want to drop it. The discussion about Marty McFly made me want to drop it just a tiny bit, just the score on that, just not much, but just maybe 0.1 or whatever, on the scale.
All right, there you go.
But at the
one.
same time, we raised something else. One of my other scores up by 0.1 because of our discussion, so it kind of just evened out.
No, you didn't.
So I was like, yeah,
No.
yes, we did.
All right, there we go. That's the pod.
So,
if you disagree,
second movie, we have to come back.
We're doing the second one. We will at some point.
Frodo's in it.
Oh, really? I don't remember Elijah Wood.
Elijah Wood is in it. He's in the second movie.
Really? That's something I feel like I would have remembered. That's crazy. Well, we'll have to know next time.
It's one of his first roles.
All right. Well, we'll see that when we see you back here next time. And as always, if you disagree with me, or more importantly, if you disagree with Andrew, let us know in the review or the comments.
I want people disagree with me.
Surprisingly, with your high review, you are the least controversial person here.
Wow,
and that's the pod.
Okay.
We hope you all enjoyed. We will be back, as we always are, next week. See you all then.